175 hectares of land, a system of rails, a ramp, a selection. And at the end of that ramp, 4 red brick structures with chimneys that never stopped smoking for 3 years.
Among the 2,819 liberated Auschwitz inmates, there were 180 children. 52 of them were under 8 years of age. How could they survive this hell?
Now imagine that someone tried to make it disappear, to erase every brick, every bone, every centimeter of soaked earth, that planted pine trees where there were graves, that built farms where gas chambers operated, that dynamited the crematoria before fleeing at dawn. This is not fiction. This is what happened between 1942 and 1945 in the camps of Eastern Europe. And what came after? The trials, the silences, the lootings, the new prisoners, the late monuments and the deniers, is a story that very few know in its entirety. Today, we are going to walk through it. From the last day of operation of Treblinka to the gallows of Auschwitz, where its own commander was hanged. From the camps that the Soviets repurposed for their own prisoners to the memorials that took decades to be built. From the manuscripts buried under the earth of extermination to the testimonies that changed the history of international law. This is what happened to the gas chambers and the extermination camps after the Second World War. Treblinka had no armaments factory or hospital. There was no medical selection on the platform. It was a center of immediate annihilation. Of the transports that arrived, almost no man, woman, or child left alive. And yet, in the spring of 1942, while the machinery of extermination was operating at full capacity in the 3 camps of Operation Reinhard, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, someone in Berlin began to ask a different question. What will happen when the war ends? What would be left of all this? The answer took the form of a verbal order, without papers, without records. Heinrich Himmler decided in the spring of 1942 that the bodies of all the victims murdered in the Eastern Territories had to be exhumed and cremated. No trace, no graves, no evidence. It was the same logic that had guided the extermination, systematic, methodical, industrial, and it would be applied now to its own cover-up. The man in charge of designing the method was SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, former commander of Einsatzkommando 4A, the unit that had carried out the Babi Yar massacre in Kiev in September 1941, where more than 33,700 people were murdered in 2 days. Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office, met with Blobel in Warsaw in March 1942 to entrust him with the mission. But Heydrich died in June 1942 from wounds sustained in an assassination attempt in Prague, and the task was put on hold for weeks. It was SS Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, who formalized Blobel's appointment in that same month. The operation received the codename Sonderaction 1005. There would be no written correspondence about it. Blobel began his experiments in Chelmno, the first extermination camp to enter into operation at the end of 1941. There, tens of thousands of Jews from the Łódź area had been murdered with carbon monoxide in sealed vans and buried in graves in the forest. The first tests included incendiary bombs, but these caused fires in the surrounding trees. Then they moved to open wooden grids with the bodies piled in layers. The bones that resisted the fire were crushed with a special machine. The ashes and bone fragments were returned to the graves from which the corpses had been removed. The result was considered satisfactory by the SS. The method was cheap, fast, and left little visible trace. Blobel's results were sent to SS Gruppenführer Odilo Globoknik, the SS police chief in the Lublin district and operational director of Operation Reinhard. But Globoknik was not a man who wanted to erase his actions. In August 1942, when SS visitors asked him if it would not be better to cremate the corpses instead of burying them, he responded with a phrase that has remained engraved in history. He stated that instead of destroying the graves, bronze plaques should be left in them saying that it had been they who had the courage to carry out such a task. He was not a man who looked over his shoulder. However, the reality of the summer of 1942 would force him to change his stance, though not for ideological reasons. In Sobibor, during the hot months, the mass graves had begun to swell. The decomposing corpses generated gases that pushed the earth upward until it rose above the surrounding surface. Whole areas of the camp became filled with insects and odors that penetrated the barracks and contaminated the drinking water wells. The commanders feared poisonings. An excavator was brought in. A huge grid was built with old railroad tracks placed on stone pillars, and they began to burn. It was the autumn of 1942. Sobibor was the first camp of Operation Reinhard to begin the systematic cremation of buried bodies. SS Unterscharführer Becker Warner, who worked as a driver in Sobibor between August and November 1942, declared years later before the court of the Sobibor case, "The corpses were taken out of the gas chambers and cremated on a specially prepared grid. The ashes and remains were buried in a designated place, and then a forest was planted there. I brought provisions to the camp and also wood to cremate the dead." Leon Feldhendler, a prisoner who survived the camp and who would be one of the leaders of the Sobibor revolt, described the beginning of the cremation in his testimony. In the first period, there was no crematorium. After the gassing, people were deposited in the graves. Then blood and a terrible smell of gas began to come out of the ground. The water in Sobibor became rancid. That forced the Germans to build a crematorium, a large pit with a grid on top. The bodies were thrown onto it. The fire was lit from below and oil was poured over the corpses. The bones were ground into ashes with hammers. The smell of burning flesh permeated the camp and its surroundings for days. There was no escape from it. Belzec was the first camp of Operation Reinhard to receive transports of Jews. It had begun to operate on March 17, 1942, under the command of Christian Wirth, the man who more than any other designed the system of extermination that would later be replicated in Sobibor and Treblinka. Wirth was known among his own subordinates as Christian the Terrible and as the Wild Beast. The Ukrainian guards called him Stuka, like the dive bombers. He always carried a whip. In Belzec, approximately 430,000 people were murdered between March and December 1942. The camp had 3 original gas chambers, later expanded to 6. All were disguised as shower facilities. The engine that pumped the carbon monoxide was installed in a separate room. The process from the arrival of the train to death took no more than 2 or 3 hours. Rudolf Raeder, one of the very few survivors of Belzec, arrived at the camp on August 17, 1942. He described in his post-war testimony the ramp, the confusion, the shouted orders, the wooden fenced corridor that led to the chambers. He escaped at the end of November 1942, just before the beginning of the cremation. His account is one of the few direct sources that exist on the inner functioning of the camp. Deportations to Belzec ceased abruptly in December 1942. With the camp paralyzed, the remaining personnel received a new mission to dig up and burn everything that was beneath the earth. There were approximately 600,000 corpses in the graves. SS Scharführer Heinrich Gley, who served in Belzec from August 1942 until the closing of the camp in September 1943, declared before the courts, "From the beginning of August 1942 until the closing of the camp in September 1943, I was in Belzec. The gassing stopped at the end of 1942, when the snow was already falling. Then began the exhumation and cremation of the corpses. It lasted from November 1942 until March 1943. The cremation was carried out day and night without interruption. At first it was burned in a single point and then in 2. One cremation site had the capacity to burn 2,000 corpses in 24 hours. About 4 weeks after the beginning, the second point was erected. On average, over 5 months, about 300,000 corpses were cremated in the first place, and in 4 months in the second, about 240,000. Naturally, these are estimates. An official Polish committee investigating German crimes in the Lublin area documented in its conclusive report, since December 1942, transports of Jews to the Belzec camp stopped. The Germans began to systematically erase the traces of their crimes. They began to remove with special cranes the corpses of those murdered, to pour highly flammable materials over them and to cremate them in large piles. Later, the procedure was improved. A grid of railroad tracks was built. The corpses were placed in layers, alternated with layers of wood. The ashes were sifted to separate valuable objects that might have remained with the corpses. Subsequently, the ashes were buried. Maria Damiel, a Polish woman who lived in the village of Belzec, witnessed the cremation processes and declared, "We could see a machine that took the corpses out of the graves and threw them into the fire." There were several fires burning simultaneously. At that time, a dreadful smell dominated the whole area, a smell of burned human bones and bodies. From the moment they began to burn the corpses, the smell came from all directions of the camp. When the Germans completed the cremation of the corpses, they dismantled the camp. The total cremation in Belzec ended approximately in April 1943. Not a single Jewish survivor remained from the prisoners who had worked in the cremation area. Rudolf Raeder had escaped before it began. Then came the dismantling. The barracks were torn down, the buildings demolished, the grids dismantled, and the SS decided that the land itself had to change appearance. A group of 12 Ukrainians was brought from Treblinka under the command of Unterscharführer Karl Schiffer to build a farm. Another group arrived from Sobibor to perform forestation work. The area of what had been the Belzec extermination camp, where 430,000 people had been murdered in less than 9 months, was planted with small pines. A small farmhouse was built. A former Ukrainian guard of the camp settled there with his family. Globoknik reported on this measure to Himmler with a note that explained the reasoning. For surveillance reasons, a small farm occupied by a guard had been created in each camp. He would have to be paid regularly so that he could maintain it. Belzec had ceased to exist. In its place was a young forest and a farm, with chickens and perhaps a dog. In Treblinka, the problem was different in scale. Approximately 900,000 people had been murdered there between July 1942 and August 1943. Not 600,000, not 250,000. Almost 1 million human beings in a camp whose total dimensions did not exceed 600 meters by 400. And when Himmler visited the camp at the end of February, or beginning of March 1943, he encountered something that disturbed him deeply. The 700,000 bodies buried up to that moment had still not been cremated. Himmler's visit to the camps of Operation Reinhard in that period was the definitive signal. The Reichsführer SSS, as documented by historian Yitzhak Arad in his study on the extermination camps, was extremely sensitive about erasing the crimes committed by Nazi Germany. The fact that the cremation began immediately after his visit makes it more than likely that he personally ordered the start of operations. A cremation facility was built in the extermination area of the camp. The structure consisted of a grid of 5 or 6 railroad tracks, supported on 3 rows of concrete pillars 70 centimeters high. The facility measured 30 meters wide. The bodies were extracted from the graves with an excavator. The camp commandant, Franz Stangl, described the process in his later testimony. It must have been at the beginning of 1943. Then excavators were brought. With those excavators, the corpses were removed from the huge ditches that had been used until then to bury them. The old corpses were burned on the grids together with the new bodies of the recent arrivals at the camp. SS Oberscharführer Heinrich Mattes, commander of the extermination area in Treblinka, declared before the courts that at that moment an SS Oberscharführer or Hauptscharführer named Herbert Floss arrived, who assumed charge of the arrangements for the cremation. The cremation was carried out in such a way that the railroad tracks and concrete blocks were placed together. The corpses were piled on these tracks. Brushwood was placed under the tracks. The wood was sprayed with oil. In that way, not only recently accumulated corpses were cremated, but also those removed from the graves. That Floss was precisely the expert sent from the other camps of Operation Reinhard. And the Standartenführer with experience in burning corpses that Inspector Wirth mentioned to Stangl was none other than Paul Blobel himself, the commander of Commando 1005. The process in Treblinka was the most intense of all. The excavator removed 6 or 8 corpses with each shovelful and deposited them on the edge of the grave. Special teams of prisoners transferred the bodies on stretchers to the grid, where another team piled them in layers until reaching 2 meters in height. Between 2,000 and 2,500 bodies, sometimes up to 3,000, were placed on the grid. Then the dry wood underneath was lit, and the flames reached up to 10 meters high. The tracks glowed red-hot. From the outer camp, 3 kilometers away, at the Treblinka 1 penal labor camp, prisoners could see the sky tinged red at night. Joachim Reichmann, a member of the burning group, the Feuerkolonne, wrote in his testimony, "The SS body-burning expert ordered us to put the women, especially the fat ones, in the first layer on the grid, face down. The second layer could consist of whatever was brought, men, women, or children, and so on, layer upon layer. Then the expert ordered us to place dry branches under the grid and light them. In minutes, the fire took such intensity that it was difficult to approach the crematorium from 50 meters away. The work was extremely difficult. The stench was dreadful. Liquid exudates from the corpses splashed the prisoner workers on all sides. The SS man operating the excavator frequently threw the corpses directly onto the prisoners working nearby, injuring them seriously. Jacob Wiernick, who was in the extermination area and survived the revolt of August 1943, described the fire at night. It was a genuine hell. From a distance, it looked like a volcanic eruption boiling through the surface of the earth and spreading flames and lava. Everything around was caught in the noise and tumult. At night, the smoke, fire, and heat were unbearable. When the flames died out, only skeletons or scattered bones remained on the grids and piles of ashes underneath. The ash group, the ash colon, collected the ashes, ground the bone fragments with round wooden sticks, sifted them through a fine metal mesh, and the fragments that did not pass through the mesh were returned to the grid to be burned again with the next batch. The ashes were then dumped into the same graves from which the bodies had been removed, covered with layers of sand, and the top 2 meters were refilled with earth. In total, the camp had 6 cremation sites in simultaneous operation, with the capacity to burn 12,000 corpses at once. Some prisoners working in the empty graves decided to leave some evidence of what was occurring. Abraham Goldfarb recounted, "Secretly, we placed complete skeletons in the walls of the graves and wrote on pieces of paper what the Germans were doing in Treblinka. We put the papers in bottles that we placed next to the skeletons. Our intention was that if one day someone looked for traces of the crimes of the Nazis, they could effectively be found." The cremation in Treblinka continued from March until July 1943. In that period, the camp continued to receive transports. The machinery of extermination and the machinery of cover-up functioned in parallel. The new dead were taken directly from the gas chambers to the grids without prior burial. The complete operation extended over 4 months because in Treblinka, more than 700,000 people had to be cremated while the camp continued to be operated. On August 2nd, 1943, the prisoners of Treblinka rose up. They had been organizing in secret for months. The group was called the Organizing Committee and was made up of prisoners who held positions with a certain freedom of movement in the camp. They had managed to steal weapons from the SS arsenal, 1 pistol at a time, 1 cartridge at a time, hiding each piece under the barracks floorboards or among the clothes of the dead they had to process. The plan was to set the camp on fire, kill the guards, and escape en masse toward the Polish forests. The uprising was imperfect. The stolen weapons were partially discovered before the set time. The plans were rushed. On August 2nd, at 16 hours, a signal sounded and the prisoners attacked. They set fire to the barracks, threw homemade grenades, shot at the guards. Hundreds of prisoners broke through the fence and ran toward the surrounding forest. The SS reacted quickly. Of the approximately 840 prisoners who were in Treblinka that day, between 300 and 400 managed to escape from the enclosure. The majority was captured and executed in the following days. Only around 70 survivors of the revolt managed to reach the end of the war alive. Stangl, the camp commander, who had spent weeks anxious thinking that he would be blamed for what happened, was called before Globoknik 3 weeks later. His fear was groundless. Globoknik informed him that he was transferred immediately to Trieste for anti-partisan operations. Stangl described years later his relief. "I felt that my bones were going to dissolve. I was so sure that they were going to blame me for something bad, and now, on the contrary, I had what I had always wanted." Franz Kurt, Stangl's lieutenant, was designated commander of Treblinka with a specific mission: to dismantle the camp and erase all evidence of its existence. Franz had at his disposal a handful of SS men, a group of Ukrainian guards, and approximately 100 Jewish prisoners who had survived the revolt. The demolition works were carried out during September and October of 1943. On November 17th, the last train loaded with camp equipment departed. Before Franz and his men departed for Sobibor, the last 30 Jewish prisoners who remained alive, including 2 women, were executed. Franz supervised the execution. Groups of 5 Jews were shot by 3 SS men. Each group, before being executed, was forced to cremate the bodies of the previous group. The last group was burned by the Ukrainians. On the ground of the former camp, sections of barbed wire, some graves, mounds of sand, and all kinds of objects still remained. An agricultural farm was built over the site, and the bricks of the gas chambers were used to build the farmhouse. A Ukrainian named Strebel, who had been a guard in Treblinka, brought his family and began to cultivate the land. The abandoned fields of Treblinka were ploughed, lupin was sown, pine trees were planted. The Sobibor uprising occurred on October 14, 1943, organized mainly by the Jewish Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Aronovich Pechersky, who had arrived at the camp in September along with a group of Soviet prisoners of war. The organization was methodical. The SS officers would be lured one by one to different workshops of the camp under different pretexts and executed in silence. Then the prisoners would try to cross the fence en masse. The plan worked partially. 11 SS officers were killed before the alarm was raised. Some 300 prisoners managed to cross the outer fence. Many stepped on mines while trying to escape. The guards opened fire with machine guns. Of the 300 who escaped that night, approximately 50 to 70 survived the war. The day after the uprising, all the prisoners who had not escaped were executed. The camp was closed. The same Jewish prisoners brought from Treblinka to help dismantle it were later murdered in the cremation area, forced to lie down on the grids where the bodies of the dead had burned and shot. The execution was carried out by Oberscharführer Wagner and the Ukrainian guards Kaiser and Bodessa. The last SS men and the Ukrainians left the camp in December 1943. As in Belzec and Treblinka, all buildings in Sobibor were destroyed. A farm was built, the land ploughed, and silence imposed. On October 19, 1943, Globoknik wrote to Himmler from Trieste, "I have concluded Operation Reinhard, which I directed in the general government on October 19, 1943, and I have dissolved all the camps." On November 30, 1943, Himmler replied, "Dear Globoknik, I confirm receipt of your letter dated November 4, 1943, and your notification regarding the termination of Operation Reinhard. I also thank you for the report you sent me. I express to you my gratitude and recognition for the great and unique services that you rendered to the entire German people by carrying out Operation Reinhard. The operation had exterminated 1.7 million Jews, and its director received a letter of thanks. Auschwitz was different. While the camps of Operation Reinhard were small and compact facilities designed exclusively to kill, Auschwitz was a complex of more than 40 square kilometers, with satellite subcamps that came to house more than 135,000 prisoners in August 1944. In Auschwitz, there were barracks, hospitals, laboratories, factories, and also, since 1942, 4 large cremation facilities in Birkenau, each of them with underground gas chambers disguised as locker rooms and showers, and double-muffled cremation ovens capable of incinerating up to 1,440 corpses a day. On October 7, 1944, the uprising of the Sonderkommando occurred. It was a radiant autumn Saturday when a small group of SS men arrived at the yard adjacent to Crematorium 4 of Auschwitz-Birkenau to order that the Special Command be formed. The approximately 660 Jewish prisoners forced to operate the extermination facilities themselves, to carry the bodies, extract the gold teeth, transfer the ashes. A Polish Jew named Chaim Neuhoff suddenly lunged forward and struck one of the guards with a hammer. Some of his companions joined in with stones, axes, and iron bars. The camp sirens filled the sky of Birkenau. The smoke that rose that day did not come from the corpses, but from the building of Crematorium 4 itself, which the prisoners had set on fire. The prisoners knew months in advance that they would be eliminated as soon as the genocide of the Hungarian Jews concluded. They had spent the spring and summer of 1944 accumulating explosives stolen from the Weichsel Union Metallwerke factory, where female prisoners worked who smuggled them to the Sonderkommando. The grenades were ready, but the larger plan of a revolt coordinated with the camp's underground movement never materialized. The majority of common prisoners considered that any open confrontation with the SS was suicidal. The Sonderkommando acted alone, with the bravery of those who know they are going to die anyway. The uprising was crushed in hours. More than 250 members of the Sonderkommando died that day. Those who managed to escape were captured. Weeks later, the SS executed the survivors, including the 4 women who had smuggled the explosives. One of them, Estucia Weichblum, wrote her sister a farewell letter after weeks of torture. "Those who are on the other side of my window still keep hope, but I have none left. Everything has been lost, and I want so badly to live." Despite the failure of the uprising, mass extermination in Auschwitz was already coming to an end. The last mass selection of Jews was carried out on October 30th, 1944, when a train arrived from Theresienstadt with 2,038 people of all ages. Of them, 1,689 were executed immediately in the gas chambers. It was probably the last mass execution that those facilities knew. Starting in November 1944, the SS authorities began the dismantling of the ovens and the gas chambers. Technical equipment was transferred, including X-ray machinery used in sterilization experiments. Construction materials were sent to other places. The 30 barracks of the warehouse known as Canada II, the gigantic section where properties confiscated from the victims were kept, were set on fire. The ruins were still burning when the Red Army soldiers arrived. Crematorium 5, the last one that had been operational, was dynamited shortly before liberation. Crematorium 4 was no longer functioning since May 1943, and it would also be the only one that the Soviets found with a certain state of preservation, because it was the rebel prisoners of the Sonderkommando themselves who set it on fire during the October uprising. On January 27, 1945, at 3 in the afternoon, Soviet troops arrived at the main camp of Birkenau. They found 7,500 prisoners alive, mostly sick and weakened, abandoned during the final evacuation. In the warehouses that had not been destroyed, they found sufficient evidence to condemn the perpetrators. 368,280 men's suits, 836,255 women's coats and dresses, 5,525 pairs of women's shoes. In the tannery, 7 tons of human hair. Just 4 days before, on January 23rd, the death march of the surviving prisoners toward the west had begun. A total of 60,000 people were forced to walk in the middle of the Polish winter, with temperatures of 20 degrees below zero. Tens of thousands died along the way. The image of the liberated concentration camps, with their structures intact and their barbed wire fences, generated in the Allies a logical temptation and a practical solution: to repurpose them. The Europe of 1945 was saturated with millions of homeless people. Internment camps needed to exist, German prisoners of war needed to be housed, and Nazi officials awaiting trial also needed custody. The solution was evident, although decades later it would prove deeply uncomfortable. With the exception of the extermination camps in Poland, which had already been closed and blown up by the Germans themselves, all of the most infamous concentration camps were put back into use by the Allies. Auschwitz, Birkenau, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald were used by the Soviets. Dachau was used by the Americans. Bergen-Belsen was taken by the British. The Ebensee camp in the Austrian Salzkammergut was used by the Americans to house 44,000 captured SS men. As historian Giles MacDonogh points out in his study on post-war Germany, the decision makes sense from an operational point of view, although today it is difficult to sustain morally. Auschwitz was partially repurposed. German prisoners, Silesian civilians, and eventually Poles accused of collaborationism were interned in some of the sections of the camp that were still standing. The ruins of Birkenau were left exposed to the elements and to looting. In the case of Sachsenhausen, the camp was taken by the Soviets and integrated into the network of what were called the Speziallager, the NKVD special camps, which operated in the Soviet zone of occupation between 1945 and 1950. In Sachsenhausen, Speziallager No. 7 functioned, which mainly housed captured Nazis, but also people detained in sometimes arbitrary denazification processes. The conditions were brutal: hunger, disease, overcrowding. It is estimated that in the 10 Soviet special camps in Germany, around 43,000 of the approximately 154,000 internees died, mostly from hunger and diseases such as tuberculosis and dysentery. Buchenwald, the camp on the Ettersberg Hill above Weimar that had housed personalities like the young Elie Wiesel, became Speziallager No. 2 under Soviet control. The new prisoners knew nothing of what had happened there before. For them, the barracks were simply barracks. Bergen-Belsen, on the other hand, was the scene of a different decision. The British removed all survivors from the main camp in 4 weeks, barrack by barrack, before burning the empty barracks. The last hut was set on fire in a ceremony held on May 21, 1945, during which soldiers and former inmates watched as the flames devoured the wooden construction with the portrait of Hitler hanging from one of its walls. It was a deliberately symbolic gesture. The British had no intention of repurposing Bergen-Belsen. In Dachau, the first concentration camp established by the Nazis in March 1933, the Americans kept the survivors while organizing their repatriation. On April 29, 1945, when troops of the 45th Infantry Division liberated the camp, they found in an abandoned train on a dead track more than 2,000 corpses. The soldiers, pale and shaking, went forward to the main enclosure, where they found 32,000 survivors of nearly 30 nationalities. Upon entering, some American soldiers summarily executed an indeterminate number of SS guards, part of whom was literally torn apart by the liberated prisoners themselves. The survivors were transferred to the better-equipped SS barracks while repatriation was being organized. In the case of the Dachauer, the Americans conducted guided tours for Allied personnel and officials. The crematoria and the gas chamber, about whose real function doubts existed given that the main execution method in Dachau was a shot to the back of the neck and that the gassing of Dachau prisoners generally occurred at Hartheim Castle in Austria, became an important part of the tour. More than 3,000 Dachau prisoners died in the Hartheim facilities. The silence that reigned in the camps of Operation Reinhard after their dismantling did not last long. Before Soviet troops arrived in the region in the summer of 1944, and with greater intensity immediately after liberation, the inhabitants of the towns and villages near Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka began to arrive with shovels and pickaxes. Rumors ran fast. The Germans had not burned all the bodies. Some Jews had been buried with their clothes without being stripped of their possessions first. In the seams and folds of the dresses there could be money, gold, diamonds. Gold teeth had also not always been extracted. And according to some informants, Jewish prisoners had buried treasures on the campgrounds. Rachel Auerbach, a Jewish-Polish writer and historian, visited Treblinka on November 7, 1945, as part of a delegation of the Polish State Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes on Polish soil. She described what she saw: masses of all kinds of looters and thieves with shovels and pickaxes in their hands were there digging, searching, raking and sifting the sand. They removed decomposed remains of dust, bones and garbage thrown there. Some placed several bombs together, made them explode, and giant pits were dug in the desecrated earth, saturated with the blood and ashes of the burned Jews. Similar scenes were repeated in the camps of Belzec and Sobibor. Edward Ludzinski, a Polish neighbor of Belzec, stated, "After cleaning the area of the extermination camp, the Germans planted the area with small pine trees and left. At that time, the entire area was literally torn apart by the neighboring population, who were looking for gold and valuables. That is why the entire surface of the camp was left covered with human bones, hair, ashes of cremated corpses, dentures, vessels, and other objects. The looters pierced the earth so frequently that the Germans, while they still controlled the area, had to send new detachments from Sobibor and Treblinka to restore the peaceful appearance of the ground and deter the diggers. They were not always successful. After the war, these excavations continued for months and years. Each section of the land was meticulously checked by local people and by people coming from afar who tried their luck. In some cases, the explosions of buried, unexploded grenades killed several of the looters. The search did not cease until the Polish government decided to turn the areas of the camps into national memory sites. The paradox was painful. The perpetrators had worked for months to erase all traces of their crimes. The post-war looters, in their greed, ended up unearthing more than what the Nazis had managed to hide. On October 18, 1945, the Nuremberg trials formally began before the International Military Tribunal. It was the first time in history that an international tribunal judged the leaders of a state for crimes against humanity. The concentration camps and the extermination camps were not the only topic under discussion, but they were a central element in the process. On November 29, 1945, the American prosecution screened a one-hour film about the atrocities of the concentration camps. Some of the 24 defendants appeared for the first time to be horrified by the spectacle. Public opinion hardened even further. Someone in the courtroom shouted, "Why don't we shoot those pigs right now?" Hermann Göring, creator of the system of the first camps, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, successor to Heydrich as head of the RSHA, and Albert Speer, director of the Reich's slave labor, all were accused of crimes directly related to the camps. The tribunal ruled that the SS was a criminal organization in its entirety, but the Nuremberg trials were not the only ones, nor even the most important for the direct perpetrators of the camps. It was in Poland, before the Polish Supreme National Tribunal, where the men who had touched the switches, who had directed the gas chambers, who had kept the count of the dead, were judged. The most decisive trial for Auschwitz began on November 22, 1947. On April 2, 1947, the commander of Auschwitz, Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss, who had been discovered the previous year by a British war crimes unit hiding on a remote farm with false documents in the name of the sailor Franz Lang, was sentenced to death. 2 weeks later, he stood on the gallows installed in the main compound of the camp that he himself had founded 7 years earlier. He made a gesture that was characteristic of his nature. He moved his head to adjust the hanging knot himself. Then the trapdoor opened. Höss had testified before the Nuremberg Tribunal in November 1945, with a frankness that disconcerted the prosecutors. He described with operational precision the functioning of the crematoria, the selection on the ramp, the use of Zyklon B. He also wrote a memoir in the Krakow prison in the first months of 1947, which has been published under the title Death Dealer, the Memoirs of the Auschwitz Commandant, and which remains one of the most disturbing documents in the history of the Holocaust. Höss described the murder of more than 1 million people as if it were the management of a logistical problem, without the slightest hint of real remorse. The only thing he regretted, he stated, was not having been a farmer. Before sentence was passed against Höss, the Polish Supreme National Tribunal had already prosecuted other individuals responsible for Auschwitz. On December 12, 1947, it declared 39 people connected to the camp guilty. Among the 23 sentenced to capital punishment were Arthur Lieberhenschel, Hans Aumeier, and Maximilian Grabner. Amon Goeth, commander of the Poiseau labor camp, immortalized in Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List, had been sentenced to death and executed on September 5, 1946, also in Poland. The Allied trials in the American zone of occupation focused mainly on the personnel of the camps liquidated by their troops. The Dachau Military Tribunal prosecuted those responsible for the main camp and, using the legal concept of common design, found guilty and sentenced most of the defendants in less than a month. They prosecuted more than 1,000 defendants related to Dachau and to the camps that had been liberated by the Americans, Mauthausen, Buchenwald, Flossenbürg, and Dora. The death sentences were executed in Landsberg prison. Commander Martin Weiss was hanged in May 1946. Before dying, he wrote a farewell letter to his young children telling them that it was worth dying for the fatherland. The British, for their part, held the first war crimes trial in Bergen-Belsen between September and November 1945, before the Lüneburg Tribunal. 30 defendants were convicted, 11 went to the gallows. Commander Josef Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen, was executed in Hameln prison on December 13, 1945, along with other camp officials. The commander of Ravensbrück, Fritz Suren, who had lived under a false identity in Bavaria until he was recognized by his former secretary, was executed by a French military tribunal in June 1950. The Soviet tribunals prosecuted officials from Sachsenhausen in Berlin in November 1947. Gustav Sorge, nicknamed Iron Gustav, and Wilhelm Schubert, known as Pistol, received life imprisonment. The former commander of the camp, Anton Kaindl, was also convicted. 6 of the 14 convicted, including Kaindl, died within a year in Soviet labor camps. For the camps of Operation Reinhard, the trials arrived later. The Belzec trial in Munich against Josef Oberhauser lasted barely 3 days, from January 18th to 21st, 1965. Oberhauser was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. The Sobibor trial in Hagen against 12 SS men was held between September 1965 and December 1966. One of the accused, Kurt Bollender, former commander of the extermination area of Sobibor, committed suicide during the process. Only 6 of the remaining were convicted. Karl Frenzel received life imprisonment, the Treblinka trial in Düsseldorf, between October 1964 and August 1965, prosecuted 10 SS men. Kurt Franz, the last commander of Treblinka, who had supervised the dismantling of the camp and the execution of the last prisoners, was sentenced to life imprisonment. 3 of his co-defendants received the same sentence. 5 were sentenced to between 3 and 12 years in prison. Gustav Wagner, one of those principally responsible for Sobibor, escaped after the war to Brazil, where he lived openly for decades. He was located in 1978, but Brazil rejected his extradition. Wagner was found dead in 1980 in circumstances never fully clarified. Franz Stangl, the commander of Sobibor and later of Treblinka, also fled to Brazil at the end of the war. He was discovered in 1967 by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, arrested and extradited to West Germany. He was tried in Düsseldorf in 1970 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison a few months after the trial concluded. The majority of the SS men and Ukrainian guards who served in the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard were never tried. The end of the war did not mean the end of impunity. Hundreds of perpetrators from the concentration and extermination camps managed to escape the reach of justice for years, decades, and some forever. Odilo Globoknik, the man who had directed Operation Reinhard and under whose orders 1.7 million Jews had died, was captured by British troops in May 1945 in a prisoner of war camp. He committed suicide on May 31, 1945, swallowing a cyanide capsule that he had hidden in his mouth. Hermann Höfler, the official responsible for the main department of Operation Reinhard, managed to go unnoticed for years. He was not arrested in Austria until 1961. On August 21, 1962, while he was held in a Vienna prison, he hanged himself in his cell. Adolf Eichmann, the SS official who had supervised the logistics of the deportations of Jews to Auschwitz and other camps from the Jewish department of the RSHA, escaped to Argentina at the end of the war and lived in Buenos Aires under the name of Ricardo Clement. The Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, located him in 1960 and captured him in a clandestine operation. He was transferred to Israel and tried in Jerusalem in 1961, in what would be the most watched trial in the world up to that date. He was sentenced to death and executed on June 1, 1962. Eichmann was the only Nazi war criminal executed by the State of Israel. During the Eichmann trial, Hannah Arendt, who covered the process for the New Yorker magazine, coined the phrase that would define decades of philosophical debate about Nazism, the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a monster in the popular sense. He was a bureaucrat who had carried out orders with methodical efficiency and without questioning them. Josef Mengele, the doctor of Auschwitz who performed deadly experiments on prisoners, especially on twins, escaped to Argentina and later to Paraguay and Brazil. He lived undisturbed for decades under the identity of Wolfgang Gerhard. He died by drowning on a beach in Brazil in 1979 while swimming at a holiday resort. His body was identified by DNA analysis in 1985. The most persistent Nazi hunter was Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of several concentration camps, including Mauthausen, where he arrived in a state of critical starvation at the end of the war. 5 days after liberation, in May 1945, he offered his services to the American officer in command of the region, arguing that the crimes committed were of such magnitude that no resource could be spared to capture those responsible. Wiesenthal dedicated his life to this mission until his death in 2005. It was largely due to the persistence of Wiesenthal and organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center that the judicial processes against perpetrators of the camps continued decades after the war. In 2011, the Munich court sentenced John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian-American identified as a guard at Sobibor, to 5 years in prison. Demjanjuk, born in 1920, had arrived at the camp as a Trauniki man, a member of the auxiliary troops trained at the Trauniki camp to serve in the extermination camps, and was recognized by survivors of Sobibor. He died before his appeals were exhausted. He was 91 years old. The SS worked for months to destroy everything. The documents were burned, the records incinerated, the gas chambers dynamited, the farms built over the graves. But there was something that the Nazis could not destroy: the determination of those who knew the truth to leave it written down. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, the members of the Sonderkommando knew that they would probably die before liberation arrived. They had seen their companions be methodically executed when the SS decided to reduce the number of people who knew the darkest secrets of the camp. So they wrote. They wrote in Yiddish, in Polish, in Greek. They wrote in the moments stolen between one shift and another. They folded the papers, put them in glass jars, sealed them, and buried them in the ground of the Birkenau crematorium, several meters deep. Zalman Gradowski wrote in the autumn of 1944, shortly before the Sonderkommando uprising, "All of us in the Sonderkommando had wanted to put an end to that terrible work for a long time. We wanted to do something big." He also wrote with lyrical prose about the hell he had to live through, about the transports that arrived, about the children he saw entering the chambers. He buried his manuscript. It was found in September 1945 in a jar buried in the grounds of the Auschwitz-Birkenau crematorium. Zalman Löwenthal, another member of the Sonderkommando, buried his own manuscript in the same place. It was found in 1962, partially deteriorated by moisture. In it, Löwenthal described the functioning of the crematorium, the sounds that came from the gas chambers, the bodies they removed hour after hour. His account ends abruptly. Leib Langfuss also wrote and buried his testimony. Langfuss was executed on November 26, 1944, in the last selection of the Sonderkommando before the evacuation of the camp. Days before his death, he had written, "We know that they are going to put us to death." In Treblinka, Abraham Goldfarb and other prisoners had placed bottles with messages inside the graves that were being emptied during the cremation of 1943. They also placed entire skeletons next to the messages, as physical evidence of what had happened there. Their hope was that if one day someone looked for traces of Nazi crimes, they could be found. Chill Reichmann, born in Opatow in 1920, was one of the very few survivors of Treblinka. He arrived at the camp in September 1942 and survived because he was selected to work as a barber, cutting women's hair before they were led to the gas chambers. He escaped during the uprising of August 1943. In 1945, in Montevideo, he wrote in Yiddish his testimony about Treblinka. It was not published during his lifetime. The manuscript, known as The Last Jew of Treblinka, is considered the only complete account written by a survivor of that camp. Reichmann wrote about the smell that permeated the camp when the crematorium was opened, about the nights when the sky was tinged red, about the bodies in flames that could be seen from the barracks, about the sound of bones being crushed. His text was rediscovered and published in 2009. Rudolf Raeder, the only known survivor of Belzec who wrote an extensive testimony, fled the camp at the end of November 1942, just before the cremation began. He published his account in Krakow in 1946. He described the ramp, the corridor with the wooden walls, the engine that pumped the carbon monoxide, the bodies piled up in the chambers. His name was practically unknown for decades. These testimonies and the manuscripts buried under the ashes became the backbone of the post-war trials. Without them, many of the judicial processes would have lacked direct first-hand evidence. Without them, later denialism would have had much more fertile ground. The extermination camps of Operation Reinhard existed for less than 2 years. They were built of wood and cheap brick in the sandy soil of eastern Poland, far from urban centers. And when the war ended, nothing remained of them that was visible to the naked eye. No buildings standing, no facilities intact, not even fences. Only earth, earth that smelled different, earth that returned bones when it rained heavily, earth that the local peasants continued to dig up in search of valuable objects years later. The first initiative to convert the sites into places of Polish national memory took time to materialize. The Polish communist government, installed with Soviet support, had its own priorities and its own narrative of the war, a narrative that emphasized Polish suffering in general, and that took decades to fully recognize the specifically Jewish dimension of the Holocaust. The first signs at the sites of the Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka camps were modest. It was not until the 60s and 70s that more substantial monuments began to be installed. Treblinka received its main monument in 1964, 20 years after liberation. It consists of a field of irregular granite stones that evoke a necropolis, in the center, a monolithic structure of black granite. There is no architectural trace of the camp itself. The land was so deeply altered by post-war looting and by the work of the SS that contemporary archaeologists have had to work with aerial imaging techniques and soil analysis to reconstruct the original layout of the facilities. Belzec took even longer. The definitive monument on the site of the camp was inaugurated in 2004. Beneath the earth that covers the memorial lie the remains of approximately 430,000 people who were never exhumed or identified. The archaeological excavation of the site, carried out in the 90s, confirmed what the testimonies had described. The earth was impregnated with ashes, bone fragments, and personal objects several meters deep. Auschwitz was different. The main camp and Birkenau were declared a Polish national monument in 1947. The same year Höss was executed on its grounds. In 1979, UNESCO included Auschwitz-Birkenau on the World Heritage List. The ruins of the crematoria, dynamited by the Germans before the arrival of the Soviets, remain as they are without reconstruction, as a testimony to deliberate destruction. The Allies made the conscious decision not to rebuild the extermination facilities. What the Nazis had destroyed would remain destroyed, as evidence of the destruction itself. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum currently receives more than 2 million visitors a year. Yad Vashem, the National Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, was established by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, in 1953. Its name comes from a verse in the book of Isaiah. "I will give them in my house and within my walls a memorial and a name." Since its foundation, Yad Vashem has gathered more than 200 million pages of documents, more than 4 million photographs and testimonies from hundreds of thousands of survivors. Its central database seeks to document the names of each of the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. To date, approximately 4.8 million have been identified. While the memorials were being built, a different current of thought was beginning to gain ground on the margins of Western academia. Historical denialism, which rejected the existence of the gas chambers or minimized the number of dead, began to organize formally in the 70s and 80s. The Frenchman Robert Faurisson published an article in 1978 maintaining that the gas chambers had never existed. The Briton David Irving, initially a historian with some academic credibility, progressively drifted toward denialist positions that earned him a libel lawsuit in 2000 against the historian Deborah Lipstadt, which he lost overwhelmingly, with the London court concluding that Irving had deliberately distorted the historical record. Denialism found an apparently fertile ground in the ruins of the camps of Operation Reinhard. There were no visible facilities, there were no intact buildings, there were no gas chambers standing to show. What the Nazis had deliberately destroyed, the denialists presented as absence of evidence. But the testimonies of the survivors, the buried manuscripts, the statements of the perpetrators before the courts, the archival documents, and the archaeological investigations together form a body of evidence that makes the Holocaust the most documented crime in history. The historian Nikolaus Wachsmann, author of the most comprehensive study on the Nazi concentration camp system, published in 2015, formulated it with precision. If historians fall into silence, a good part of the history of the camps will soon be left in the hands of eccentrics, dilettantes, and denialists. The answer to denialism is history, not polemic, but the rigorous accumulation of verifiable evidence. For the 7,500 prisoners that Soviet troops found in Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, liberation was not the end of their suffering. It was the beginning of another kind of life. A life marked by what they had seen, by those they had lost, and by the impossible task of explaining to the world what had happened. The survivors of the Operation Reinhard camps were extraordinarily few. Of the approximately 700 prisoners who were in Treblinka on August 2, 1943, when the revolt occurred, perhaps 70 reached the end of the war alive. From Belzec, barely a handful. Rudolf Reder was probably the only one who gave extensive testimony. From Sobibor, around 50 survived. Chil Rachman, the last Jew from Treblinka who wrote his memoirs, arrived in Montevideo. Abraham Goldfarb, who had placed bottles with messages inside the graves, survived the war and was a witness in the Treblinka trials in Dusseldorf in the 60s. Sasha Pechersky, the lieutenant of Soviet origin who had led the Sobibor uprising, returned to the Soviet Union after the war. The Soviet authorities received him with suspicion, Any Soviet citizen who had fallen prisoner to the Germans was considered suspected of collaborationism. It took decades for Pechersky to be officially recognized as a hero of the resistance. The survivors of Auschwitz faced their own difficulties. Jules Schelvis, a Dutch Jew who had lost his entire family in Sobibor, wrote from a French military hospital on May 26, 1945, a few weeks after being liberated from a subsidiary camp of Nachtweiler. "I have to start living again without a wife and without a family." The return to their homes was, for the majority of Eastern European Jews, an additional blow. The houses had been occupied by others. Neighbors refused to return confiscated properties. Anti-Semitic hostility had not disappeared with Nazism. In Poland, where 3 million Jews had been murdered, post-war pogroms occurred, the best known of which happened in Kielce on July 4, 1946, when a crowd attacked Holocaust survivors housed in a building, killing 42 people and injuring 40 others. Lena Stumachin, a survivor of several camps, walked back from Saxony to Zakopane in southern Poland with swollen legs. In her imagination, she had the image of her house engraved, and she hoped that her people would return. When she arrived, where her home had been, there was a herd of goats grazing. She found no trace whatsoever of her husband or her daughter. She spent days and then weeks waiting in vain. For Eastern European Jewish survivors who could not return to their homes or who did not want to do so, the main alternative during the years 1945 to 1948 was Palestine and later the State of Israel, proclaimed on May 14, 1948. But even their integration was difficult. The new immigrants sometimes faced the distrust of those who had preceded them, poverty, and the psychological shadow of what they had lived through. The scars were not only psychological. Hermine Horvath, a gypsy survivor of Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, revealed during an interview in January 1958 that infections, the after-effects of frostbite, and medical experiments had left her unable to work. She died 2 months after that interview at 33 years old. Jean Améry, a Judeo-Austrian philosopher who had survived Auschwitz and other camps, wrote about the permanent damage that torture produced, that once the body has been subjected to the will of another, that domination never completely disappears. He committed suicide in 1978. Primo Levi, the Italian chemist whose testimony about Auschwitz, "If This Is a Man," is considered one of the fundamental texts of the 20th century, died in 1987 in what indications point to as a suicide, 42 years after liberation. He had written about the memory of the offense that accompanied survivors for decades, denying peace to the tormented. Not all survivors sank. Thomas Bergenthal, the boy Tommy whom the Norwegian writer Odd Nansen had met in the infirmary of Sachsenhausen, the boy who had lost 2 toes to frostbite during the death march from Auschwitz, arrived in New York in 1951 as a teenager. He developed a top-tier legal career and was appointed a member of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the highest international court in the world. Years later, when asked why he had survived, his invariable response was a single word: luck. Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of Mauthausen, turned his survival into a mission. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, founded in Los Angeles in 1977, remains active. Wiesenthal died in 2005, having contributed to the capture and prosecution of more than 1,100 Nazi criminals. Visiting the sites of the Operation Reinhard extermination camps today is an experience that no description can fully prepare one for. In Treblinka, the memorial occupies the area of the former extermination camp. 17,000 granite stones of different sizes are arranged over an area of several acres. Each stone represents a destroyed Jewish community. In the center, a larger stone bears inscribed in Polish, Hebrew, English, and Yiddish, "Never again." The ground itself is composed in large part of sand and turned earth, ashes that mixed with the soil during the cremation and cover-up works of 1943. When it rains heavily, small bone fragments come to the surface. There is not a single brick from the original camp. The Ukrainian Guardian's farm disappeared decades ago. The pine trees that the SS planted grew and were cut down. The lupin that was sown to conceal the graves bloomed and died with the seasons. In Belzec, the memorial, inaugurated in 2004, consists of a deep rift that cuts through the landscape, a slice in the earth that forces the visitor to descend. The walls of the rift are covered with fragments of dark stone. At the bottom, inscriptions in Hebrew and Polish. The entire surface of the memorial rests on the remains of the 430,000 murdered. The archaeologists who worked on the site during the 90s determined that any significant excavation would irreparably violate the human remains that stay underground. The memorial preserves the soil without touching it. In Sobibor, the site is more modest. A memorial marked with an eternal flame and a stone plaque. The Sobibor forest surrounds the place, silent. In 2014, systematic archaeological excavations began that confirmed the exact location of the gas chambers, identified the contours of the camp, and recovered thousands of personal items belonging to the victims. In Auschwitz, the ruins of the crematoria and gas chambers of Birkenau remain just as the explosions of November and January of 1944 to 1945 left them. The basements of the locker rooms, which were actually the anterooms to the gas chambers, can be visited. The SS did not manage to destroy everything. The concrete walls still stand, collapsed into the ground, opening to the sky of Auschwitz. The ovens of Crematorium 1 in the main camp have been partially reconstructed for visitors for pedagogical reasons. A plaque informs of this circumstance. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum preserves the items confiscated from the victims that the SS did not manage to destroy or send to Germany before the arrival of the Red Army. The tons of human hair, the thousands of piled shoes, the suitcases with names and addresses, the spectacle frames, the prostheses. These objects are not museum exhibits in the conventional sense. They are evidence. They are the material demonstration that behind each number tattooed on an arm there was a person with a name, an address, a suitcase full of things they thought they were going to need. Himmler and Globoknik believed they could erase what they had done. They planted forests, they built farms, they dynamited the crematoria, they burned the documents. They ordered that there be no written correspondence regarding Sonderaction 1005. And yet here we are, talking about it, with names, with dates, with testimonies. What they could not erase was the determination of those who knew to leave evidence. Abraham Goldfarb placing bottles with messages inside the empty graves of Treblinka. Salman Gradowski burying his pages in Yiddish next to the Birkenau crematorium. Chill Reichman writing in Montevideo in 1945 what he had seen so that the world would know it. Stanisław Kwodziński smuggling out lists of victims from Auschwitz and sending them to London. Rudolf Raeder publishing in Krakow in 1946 his account of Belzec. What they could not erase was the memory embodied in the people who survived, and what they could not erase was the earth itself. The earth of Treblinka, of Belzec, of Sobibor, of Auschwitz. An earth that returns bones when it rains. An earth that archaeologists have learned to read like a text. An earth that knows what occurred upon it, even though all the buildings have disappeared. The trials were not perfect. Many perpetrators escaped. The Cold War slowed down the processes for decades. Some of the greatest criminals lived long lives in impunity. But international law changed forever after Nuremberg. The concept of crime against humanity, the principle that heads of state do not have immunity for ordering mass extermination, the idea that individuals are responsible before international law regardless of the orders received. All of this emerged directly from the trials that prosecuted the perpetrators of the camps. Crematorium 5 of Auschwitz was dynamited days before the arrival of the Red Army. Today its remains are in the same place where they fell, covered in snow in winter, surrounded by silence all year round. No one has reconstructed them. No one will move them. They will remain there as they are because the destruction itself is part of the story that is narrated. The Nazis destroyed them because they were afraid of the truth, and the truth survived anyway. Every story has a last witness, the last Jew from Treblinka, the last member of the Sonderkommando who buried his manuscript, the last prisoner of Sobibor who crossed the fence running toward the forest in October of 1943. When the last witnesses die, what they wrote, what they described, what the earth preserves, and what law recorded will remain. The work of the historians who do not allow the evidence to be diluted will remain. And the question that should not have an easy answer will remain, how it was possible, not as rhetoric, as a warning.